and thanks for being with us. Okay, give it one extra minute. So glad everybody's back. Okay, our next topic on the agenda is to spend some time with Susan Brower from the Minnesota State as a demographer, and she'll give us some interesting information. I'm sure lots of data that we can review together. I expect this to be very insightful and also to have a very robust conversation throughout the session. So with that, Susan, thanks again for being here with us today and for sharing a lot of the insights you bring forward. And I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I guess it's still morning here. I've prepped some stuff to share with you about how the state is growing and some of the data that we have out of the Census Bureau, which is the data that I'm most used to working with, about broadband use. Who's using it, how are they using it, where are they located. I know you all have wonderful maps, but I just want you to be aware too that we've got data with a lot of demographic and occupational information too, that you may wish, if you're not already using it, you may wish to supplement with some of the census data with the data that you're using. And so I'm going to share my slides with you right now and begin by talking a little bit about how and where the state is growing. Okay, can you see my slides okay?
Yep.
Okay, beautiful. So you may have heard that the first of the census data were released about a month ago. Right now, we only have 2020 census data on state totals. We don't have that rich information about how parts of the state are growing relative to other parts, but we do have these high-level numbers about how Minnesota is growing relative to other states. And so what we learned from this first release of the data is that Minnesota added about 400,000 people over the course of the decade between 2010 and 2020, and grew by 7.6%, which was just about the state average, or the national average. The nation grew at 7.4%, and you can see if you compare us to most other Midwestern states, those off to the east of us in particular, you can see that growth rates tend to be lower than they are for Minnesota. Illinois actually lost population in the last decade. West Virginia lost population, and many states have experienced a slowdown in growth that comes with population aging. Now we see higher rates of growth in North Dakota and South Dakota. Yes, that's true when you're looking at percentage terms, but these are very small numbers when you think about the states, the size of those populations, the number that were added to those states. For larger states like Minnesota, Minnesota really does lead the Midwest in growth, in substantial growth. And if you look at other states in other parts of the U.S. outside of the Northeast, outside of the Midwest, you can see that the areas of the U.S. that are growing fastest remain to be southwestern states and southern states. That's just part of a longer term pattern. I mentioned kind of this comparison to other states just to kind of drive home this picture. We're looking here 2010 to 2019 to give you some scale. That 400,000 that I mentioned is very in a different category altogether than the 2.3 million that were added to California, the 3.8 million in Texas, or 2.7 million in Florida. So you can see we're doing okay for where we are, just nowhere near the level of growth as some of those southern states. So we don't have, as I said, the 2020 data yet. Oh, I know what I should have told you before we started out here. Please stop me if you have questions. I can only see Teddy, but if you have questions, please do hop on and interrupt me. There's also time for questions at the end. And I'm happy to take them as I go or at the end. So
I have a question for you. So
yeah.
As you look at the growth, I mean, it's from 2010 to 2020. Has that been a steady increase, or is it declining in the last few years, increasing in the last few years?
Yeah, so I would say it's very slowly declining. And when people think about growth, they tend to think about migration driving it. What it really is just our age structure. So the number of older people that we have relative to the number of babies that we're having. Those are the main drivers of growth right now. And so I would say, just like the U.S. has kind of tapered off in terms of growth, Minnesota is moving that way too. And it's just kind of an inevitable outcome of having an older state.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So looking at the state's growth based on our population estimates, we make these estimates in our office, and we base them off the 2010 census, but then we also keep track of building permits, so new housing. We use average household size. We keep track of kind of boundary changes to come up with these estimates. And we're typically fairly accurate with these, but if you're wondering how did I get 2019 data, that's how we do it. We use administrative records to make up these estimates. What's happened in the last decade is the growth has really been concentrated in our metropolitan areas, which you can see in the blue and darker blue areas, and along that I-94 corridor. I would say that most of the growth, the majority of the growth, has happened in the 7-county Twin Cities metro. You can see 80% of that growth in those first 9 years of the decade. Even more so than that growth has really been concentrated in Hennepin and Ramsey County. So this has been a decade of enhanced urban growth. Yes, it's part of a very long-term trend that we've seen in terms of rural depopulation, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Yes, we have seen more urban growth, but I would say that it's not limited to the Twin Cities metropolitan area. You can see up on the western edge, that's Clay County, where Moorhead, the Fargo-Moorhead metro is located. You can see Olmsted County sticking out in terms of numeric growth. Most of the metropolitan areas of our state have been growing this decade. I say most because with the exception of Duluth, which has had more of a stable population than a whole lot of growth. Another way to look at this growth is just by state legislative districts. We've created these maps because redistricting is right around the corner, but I think they're really useful to tease out where the growth is happening. And the green areas on this map show that there is less growth happening. The white areas, it's just about equal. There's some growth there, but the real kind of centers of growth are showing up in these maps in brown. And you can see again, a brown area around St. Cloud, around Moorhead, around Rochester. The metro areas really are those centers of growth. What I will say that a lot of people do not appreciate about population growth or stability in rural areas is that it's not that we're seeing kind of a massive emptying out of those areas. It's more a picture of stability. We're not seeing as much growth as we're seeing in other areas, but that doesn't mean that these areas are quickly emptying out. For some areas, there is a very, very slow decline, but for most, we're seeing more stability in those rural areas than most people understand. And if we look at our 8 congressional districts, you can see the change in population on the far right-hand column, that all of our 8 congressional districts have grown. Of course, many of them do contain metropolitan areas, but you can see that even our slowest growing, the 8th district, has grown over the last 9 years. It's just not the level of growth that our metro, particularly Twin Cities Metro and up along that I-94 corridor, have seen over the last 9 years or so. Now, switching, we've been looking at where the growth has happened. So we're looking here, this is all the change in the population from 2010 to 2019. That's what we're looking at here. Or the difference in the population in terms of redistricting, what will need to change in terms of redistricting. But what we're switching to look at in the next couple of maps is just where our rural and urban areas in the state are located. And if you haven't seen this view of our state, I would encourage you to spend some time with it. I found it really useful. And that's just because when we look at our state at the major metropolitan areas, it masks a lot of the variation in urbanicity and rural areas because the definitions are so blunt. The USDA has created this scheme for every census tract in the U.S. So we're looking at census tracts in Minnesota. And so, you know, a census tract is typically about 5,000 people, 3,000 to 5,000 people. And the very darkest blues are showing you the very most urban part of our state. And the yellow parts of the state are truly the rural areas of our state. And so I like using these RUCAs to kind of understand how urban or how rural our state is, because it's a much kind of finer tuned tool than we have when we look at a lot of the census measures. These RUCA areas also take into account smaller towns, and they take into account small towns that are connected to larger areas. So higher levels of commuting into a larger area are accounted for in this classification scheme, and then lower levels of commuting. So it's not just a question of whether the area looks remote if you're standing on a road in that particular census tract. It's also its proximity to another economy that helps classify how rural or how urban it is. So I'm sharing this with you because I want you to be aware that we have these data that can help us identify this level of urbanicity or this level of rural, and that we also, which I'll share with you in a moment, have information about broadband access in each of these rural versus urban. Now I can put them together today as a map, but you may choose to look in more detail in the future. What we've done for many of our analysis, because it's hard to get your head around all 10 categories at once, is we've collapsed many of these areas into just urban, large town, small town, and rural. This may be a way that you wish to conceptualize of the state as well, and it's to the internet. When we look at these 4 categories here on the map, take a long look. The dark blue again is the very urban areas. The large town is the lighter color blue, smaller towns in green, and then the rural areas in yellow. As of mid-decade, so 2015, the vast majority of the state, 73% of Minnesotans lived in one of these urban areas that we're looking at here on the map. So they could be in any one of those dark blue areas, that's 73%. About 8% lived in a fully rural population, living in those yellow areas there. About 7% living in small towns, and about 11% in a large town. So it gives you a sense of how people are distributed across these spaces as well. And as we get the 2020 census data in the next year, we will be kind of updating and have more to say about just exactly where in Minnesota that growth has happened. But for now, we're relying on our population. Take a breath there, because I know it's hard to get a word in edgewise. I do have more to share with you, but are there any questions at this point from anyone?
Any questions for Susan? As usual, you can raise the hand and I'll call it, or you can put it in the chat. I'll monitor both.
Okay, beautiful.
No hands raised or no questions in the chat right now, Susan. So.
Gotcha. We took this over the 87 Minnesota counties that we have to come up with a new classification scheme that kind of tells us what type of a county we have, what type of a county we're looking at when we're looking at one of 87 of Minnesota's counties. This is out of a report that we did in 2017 called Greater Minnesota Revised and Revisited. It's on our website, and so you're welcome to go read through this. But what we found is very similar to the story I was telling you before, is that in rural areas, counties that are either entirely rural or have some mix of a town, a small town, and a rural area, yes, we are seeing population declines. They're small, they're modest. Altogether, that's what we're seeing, is that very modest population decline. It looks like it maybe has picked up for some of our town or rural mixed counties in the first part of this last decade. And what we have seen is the entirely urban areas pick up in terms of growth in this last decade. Okay, so that was generally how the state's population has changed and how we are made up as a state in terms of urbanicity and rural areas. I want to turn now to what the Census Bureau has to give us the information it has to give us about internet use in Minnesota. There's an ongoing survey that the Census Bureau conducts called the American Community Survey. It's a huge survey. Some of you may have received it, but it asks questions about people's access to the internet and what type of service they have. And you can see the questions that are asked here, both kind of what type of a device do they use to access the internet, and then what type of internet service provider do they have, and you can see the categories here. The great thing about having this in the survey is not necessarily for these three questions alone, but it's in a single survey that also collects information about people's race, ethnicity, their income, their occupation, work status, very fine detailed geography like I was just sharing with you. It has detailed information about age. It has commute patterns, whether people are working from home. And so there's all kinds of information that together with these internet questions can be gleaned. And so I wanted you to be aware of it. And in the future, if there are specific things that this group would like to know, I certainly can point you in the direction or share with you the information that's available out of this survey. To get enough information for small geographies, 5 years of data are pooled together. And so what I'll be sharing with you in the next few slides is pooled information either from 2013 to 2018 or 2014 to 2019. One of the good things, another good thing about having this ACS data is that we have a full U.S. to compare it to. So it's not only within Minnesota where we can make comparisons, but across the U.S. as well. And what we're looking at here is the percentage of households with any broadband service. According to the Census Bureau, this survey that I shared with you, the Census Bureau includes in broadband, in this definition of broadband that I'll share with you here, it also includes a cellular data plan is considered broadband. Another service like cable, fiber optic, or DSL is considered broadband, and then satellite as well. So it's really dial-up or no service that would be considered not broadband. I know that may or may not differ from the definition you're using, but I wanted you to be aware when you're looking at these maps. We zoom in a little bit further, we can see at the county level where there's the higher rates of broadband access. So again, we're looking at the percentage of households that have some type of broadband internet subscription. And then comparing this information to what we have in what I shared with you earlier, just in terms of the very detailed RUCA codes, or rural urban commuting area codes, you can see really a very similar pattern across. This may come as no surprise to you, but you can see kind of the geography mapping onto each other, not always perfectly. But you can certainly see along that I-94 corridor where we have greater levels of urbanicity, that we also see along that same corridor higher levels of broadband subscriptions as well. And the metropolitan areas are not always mapping on perfectly to broadband subscriptions, which I think is interesting to compare as well. If we look at East Grand Forks, for example, we see lower levels of that broadband subscriptions relative to higher levels of urbanicity. So they don't perfectly map onto each other, but I just wanted to generally give you a sense of how people report their own internet access compared to where they're living. And this is kind of one of the most detailed looks that we can have in terms of geography.
And Susan, just for clarification, I mean, the map you have there on the left, it's just the same as the one before, just different shading of colors. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you. So it's actually a little bit different. This is showing at the household level and at the county level. So it's asking within your household, do you have access to broadband? And then it's looking at the county level what the percentage is. What we're looking at here is the census tract level, so it's a little bit finer geography. And this actual measure that I selected here is the number of people with access to it. So it's not only household. It probably maps very closely to the percent of the household, but that's what we're looking at.
Got it.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's one question from Mark Johnson, or a comment, hand up.
Yep, I had put this in the chat too, but just to be clear, can the data for this ACSD survey, can it be disaggregated by type of broadband service because they answer that question that way, or is it just that has never been done, so it's always all lumped together?
I absolutely love it when people have a question for which I have a visual.
Look at that. There we go. Thank you.
Look at that. But you know what? I can't disaggregate further than this. So this is as fine as it gets. They really do lump together cable, fiber optic, or DSL into one group. So I know you all are a very special group of consumers for this type of information. And so this may not do it for you, but this is, at least we can see kind of what is cellular data plan versus satellite versus some other kind of fiber optic. And you may have already picked up on my language. I'm not sure I'm even using the correct language that you all would use to describe this. I'm using the Census Bureau's term. What we can see here, of course, is that 70% of Minnesota households have some type of broadband subscription. including cable, fiber optic, or DSL. About 14% have no internet service at all, and then the remaining both 6% have satellite and then cellular data. They're accessing the internet. That's 10%. Those are folks with only a cellular plan and not another kind of internet access. Of course, the percentage with a cellular plan is much higher than that if you're not looking at cellular alone. Dial-up is about 1% of the state's services. And then I pulled out, we can look at this at the...
1 second. Mark, did you have another question, or was it from earlier? The hand up.
Sorry, thought I took it down. My bad.
It's good. It's all right. Good.
Let's keep going.
Okay, wonderful. I pulled out the counties that had the lowest rates of broadband subscriptions. So Lake of the Woods is just over 50%. You can see kind of from the least to the next 15 in order where counties fall. And you can see kind of that there's a fairly similar share of type of service provider. I don't know if this is surprising to you. I had no idea myself what these numbers would look like. I guess I maybe wasn't expecting to see quite as many people accessing the internet only through cellular or satellite, but perhaps that's not surprising to you. I guess another thing that is rather striking to me is even though we see these high levels of access, 70% of the state's households, in some of these areas, we've got really large proportions of those counties with no access whatsoever. Again, that may not be surprising to this group as that's your task right in front of you, but this is what the data are showing us from the Census Bureau.
Yeah, and it's not as surprising for, I think, two reasons in my mind. Maybe there's others, but one is, you pointed it out, I mean, maybe there's no other access to internet other than a cellular plan, right?
Yeah.
So there's access to the home, so it's folks are using. The other one hits on the affordability issue. Like if you had to choose between an $80 a month or $100 a month internet service versus I can only afford to have a cell phone plan, most are going to go with a cellular plan, just because you could use it. It's more mobile, right? So
absolutely. Yeah, good thoughts. Thank you. As I mentioned, these numbers in the survey allow us to look at access of Minnesota households and Minnesota individuals by different demographic characteristics. And so we can look at the percent of the population in Minnesota that have broadband internet, a subscription is the question. Not access necessarily, could they buy a subscription, but do they have a subscription? And you can see that there is quite a difference across racial groups. There's quite a difference across age groups. Again, probably not too surprising, both given what we know about how people access and why people access the internet, and also what we know about the age distribution of more rural areas that tend to be older as well. Many of these demographic characteristics kind of follow the shape of who we know live or are more likely to live in some of these rural areas, including some of our BIPOC communities, where we see more of a concentration of Asian and Black or African American residents in Minnesota actually in the urban areas, and we see more of a dispersion across the state, including rural areas of American Indian populations, indigenous populations, and Hispanic or Latino populations. Of course, that's not true of all communities. I'm just painting in broad strokes to say we do see more some communities of color tend to be more concentrated in metropolitan areas. And then we see these differences. Mainly I'm sharing with you probably what we would expect in terms of educational attainment. We can also look at these things in terms of income groups. The list is really, if you can think of kind of a major demographic or economic characteristic of a family, we probably can look at broadband internet use based on these. And so I'm sharing with you these examples just to kind of get your mind thinking about what would be useful to this group as you do your work. With the time remaining, I want to shift to a couple more topics. That's really what I had in terms of the data for the American Community Survey. I want to shift on what we've been seeing in terms of use or patterns that may shift how people use the internet in the future. And then also to talk about a few of the studies that I've seen that shows the impact of access to high-speed internet, both on population growth and economic growth. So I'll share those studies at the end after I kind of share with you what we've seen recently in terms of internet use during COVID-19. I hope I'm not giving you all too much whiplash. I wanted to pour in all the resources that I had that I thought may be relevant to you, and so it might feel like a bit of a grab bag, but I swear maybe we should think of it as the best of hits. I don't know. I'm sharing with you now something that also comes from a Census Bureau survey, but it's a slightly different survey. It's called the Household Pulse Survey, and it's done on a weekly basis, and it began with the start of the pandemic. And it really was aimed at trying to measure on a state-by-state basis and at the national level how people were adapting to COVID. So there are questions here that I think are relative or of interest to this group. There's also a whole slew of questions, related to vaccines and income changes, all those kinds of things. But what I'll share with you today is just what we've seen in terms of behavior changing and internet behavior changing or telework behavior changing since the pandemic. What this Household Pulse survey has shown is that Minnesota is among the highest states that reported where households reported having teleworked because of COVID-19. So 39% is the national average, but you can see that, again, Minnesota kind of stands out in terms of its higher proportion of residents who switched to telework during COVID-19. This question was asked just recently, March 2021, and it asked to look back over the whole COVID period. So was there any change in behavior? And you can see here that Minnesota ranks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6th in terms of states. District of Columbia is a bit higher at about 60%, but you can see really that there has been a major impact, a major shift that has impacted close to 50% of Minnesota households shifting to telework. And I think we all are well aware that having experienced this shift in our own behavior, that it opens up the door to new possibilities in the future for continuing to telework, either entirely or partly. And I think it also opens up the possibility where there is broadband access to have more mobility in more of those rural areas as long as there's broadband access. I'll talk about this in a moment, but I have not yet seen data that truly points to massive population changes because of broadband internet access, but I would say that the pandemic, if anything, will have sped a transition to more remote work and kind of could lay the groundwork for more of that mobility out to some of those rural areas where it just wasn't possible before. Another question that this Household Pulse survey asks, and this was just asked this week, was just what is the proportion of households households that have internet available for educational purposes. This was asked of households only with children. So this is a select group of households in Minnesota, only of households with children in the U.S. as well. I wouldn't make a whole lot of the difference. You can see that Minnesota has a slightly lower proportion than the U.S. overall of having internet available for educational purposes always available. This is, as I said, an experimental weekly survey, and so there's going to be some margin of the error there. I think you should really just focus, at least when I look at this, what I'm focusing on is generally the distribution, that the vast majority of Minnesotans have internet for educational purposes, either usually or always available. And then I think that you can have some interesting additional analysis should you choose to see just what groups have it sometimes or rarely available. To kind of wrap up here, I just want to share with you some of the studies that have already looked at how population growth has changed as a result of internet access or broadband access. And I did a scan. This is not my demographics is my area of expertise, but I did a scan of the literature just to see a sense of where folks were at in covering this question. I found that there is some evidence that the presence of broadband increases or has the potential to increase, and actually did increase growth among highly educated women in Germany, and that is because they're able to increase time spent with their kids and to combine working from home, commuting from home, and having children at the same time. So there is limited evidence of increased number of children, or fertility as we call it as demographers. Whether that impact happens here in the U.S. remains to be seen, but that is kind of one pathway through which broadband could impact population growth. Another study did actually find a slowing of depopulation of areas that were sparsely populated, much like those yellow areas in the map that I shared with you in Minnesota. There was a study in Finland, excuse me just for a minute. There was a study in Finland that showed that broadband actually reduced very slow depopulation of some areas. Excuse me. And then some of the early studies that I found just in the U.S. in particular at the county level found very little growth associated with broadband use. I think that really, if we look at some of these studies, it's too early to tell what the impact will be. I still think that we probably should be looking at 15 to 30 year horizon, not a 5-year age group, when we're looking at what the impact of investing in this infrastructure will be for rural America. I'm going to stop for a moment because I can't get rid of this tickle. Does anyone have a question for me?
Any questions for Susan? Again, just raise your hand or put it in the chat. Let me check the chat real quick.
Okay. I think I got rid of it, maybe.
Let's see. No, okay.
Okay, let me wrap up here. I did find one report from Purdue University that I thought was pretty interesting. It's fairly recent, and it had a piece that was Minnesota specific. What they did is they looked at rural broadband providers and asked them to share what companies or what clients they had sold to and how many jobs that work had supported. And so they aggregated up, by working through these rural broadband networks, the number of jobs that were created, they aggregated up the sales of those companies and also the salaries. And so I just wanted you to be aware of this, and the piece that I found particularly interesting was that it separates out the different kind of ripple effects through rural areas that having broadband, it kind of helps you visualize, I think, by looking at the individual types of industries that are impacted kind of at the first rank, the second rank, and the third rank. It starts to give you the sense of how the economic impacts of broadband ripple through these different industries and through a rural area. With that is what I have prepared, and I am going to stop my screen so I can see you all again. Hello again. Do you have any questions for me?
Thank you, Susan.
You're the second group I talked to today, so I guess my voice was all done. Sorry about that.
No worries. We're able to follow you.
Okay.
Any questions for Susan on the data you saw now, or maybe something you didn't see? Check the chat. Mark Johnson has a question or comment. Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, Susan, for that. That was fabulous information. Really appreciate you taking the time to do that for us. Can you just tell us a little bit about where can we go out and find some of that data ourselves if we want to dig deeper or look?
Most of what I shared with you today is on the Census Bureau site. So if you're interested in the data that I shared with you from the American Community Survey, and that's all the demographic information on how people access the internet, that's on a tool. I'll put it in the chat so you have it, but it's just on the Census Bureau site. It can be a little tricky to navigate their extraction tool, and so we have a demography helpline in our office. We're happy to help people find what they need, but I will put in the chat how you can access most of those data. Is that the information you were most interested in, or was one of the other things that I talked about?
No, that's great. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, good. I'm glad it was useful.
Yvonne has her hand up.
Well, I had a similar question, but I'll expand on it. Is there anyone in your office that's doing regression analysis, pulling out, dependent and independent variables around this data, to answer specific questions? For example, if we posed a question versus a map, can we get regression sorts of analysis done?
I would say that we are not doing anything like that right now. It's not that it couldn't be done. It's just not something we currently have the capacity to do. So right now, I am the only demographer in our office, and we have 4 staff members. We're a tiny office. We have 4 staff members. It's something I would love to be able to do projects like that. I think it would be really useful. But right now, our main role is just pointing others to how they can use the data to do the kinds of things that you're talking about. And so if you have someone that would like to do something like that, we'd be happy to share with them what we know. But no, we just don't have the capacity to do that right now.
I'll be in touch about that. I have students that are working on data analytics degrees, and they need data sets, right?
Oh, that would be perfect. Yes, that would be fantastic. And what surprised me is I didn't even see that when I did a scan of the literature, that's the work that I cited on population growth and broadband access. They were doing different kinds of regression or spatial regression to tease those out, but they're not very recent. Most of the things that they were looking at were from early 2000s, which we know has. It's a world away. 2000.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Other questions or comments for Susan? Susan, I'm not seeing any other hands up or any other comments.
Can I just leave you with one more thought that because I study migration, well, I just launched in before you even answered, didn't I, Teddy?
Go ahead.
Okay. Um, uh, One of the things I think that helps people understand just how important broadband is for developing rural areas. I hear from people all the time who want to move back to their communities. But the decision to move back is typically not always, but it's often made by two people, not by one person. And I think that there's a multiplier effect of having internet, is that you open up the whole range of possibilities, the whole range. Most couples need to choose a metropolitan area because they have the mix of industry to be able to settle. And so I think people start to understand just what possibility broadband opens up when they bring it down to that personal level of a couple making a decision together, perhaps in two different occupations or industries. So for me, that was a learning, and I just thought you all may be like, yeah, we know that, lady. But for me, that was really an interesting thing to think about, is just how couples make decisions to move.
Yeah, no, it's a great insight in it, because you're looking at that migration. You definitely see that. So
yeah.
Okay, again, I'm not seeing any hands up, but again, super helpful information. And I think we may even, as we go deeper and continue to put our recommendations together, we might reach out to you. Either the subgroups will reach out separately because they want, some maybe more in-depth data about something specific. Or we may just have you again as we get together as a group and say, we'll have some other questions. So
that's great.
But again, we want to thank you for your time and kind of taking time out of your calendar to be here with us. That's been great, and great information as well.
Good. Thanks for having me, and I'll send you slides in case anyone's interested.
Okay, perfect.
Goodbye.
All right,
bye, everyone.
Take care. All right, we're at 12:05. So as you saw, kind of a packed agenda with lots of information for us today. We're not going to do any updates or overview on the subgroups. We'll have plenty of time for that at the next meeting. We're going to reserve more ample time. Other business from the task force members to bring up to anyone? Just looking to see if there's any hands that go up, or if you can't do that, you can just come off mute if needed. Okay, not hearing any from any task force members. Is anybody else that's not on the task force? Would you like to make any public comments? I did hear sound there. Was there someone who needed to? Oh, Steve?
Sorry, Teddy. Sorry to interrupt. I was curious, we had a discussion about meeting in person. Is that any change in the plan for folks on that? It's been a long time since we sat in the same room together.
Yep. So obviously, I think the meeting in June, we're still going to do virtual, so that's the next one. And we don't have a meeting in July. And then we have a meeting in August. So in the one in August, we're trying to figure out if that's one thing we could do face-to-face, right? I think that'd be a great one to get together. And we should be through the period where vaccinations have caught up, and we can at least have some more definite guidelines of what we can and can't do. So that's at least what I'm trying to target, to see if we can get together in that August timeframe. Now, the other thing that's a little bit tricky, and we'll have to have a venue because the deed office has moved in the process through the past year and a half. So there's not a place where we can meet, but we could do it as an organization. But we also have a list of places we could have gone with several companies that are offered to host us for a meeting. So we'll look into that and see if we can get something arranged.
Teddy, this is Diane. I put in the chat, we have a meeting July 28th and then no meeting in August.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I think we switched that. So that July 28th meeting. Okay. Any other comments from any other business from folks not on the task force? Steve Georgie, I see you have your hand up.
Teddy, we had this conversation just briefly in our subgroup, and then I heard again today when you asked about the experiences of the wireless providers with border-to-border grant program, and one of them made mention to the concerns over RDOF, and with all of the census blocks in the state of Minnesota being earmarked for RDOF funding, that the state border-to-border grant program cannot overlap. And I believe in our conversation in the subgroup, Diane indicated, the Office of Broadband follows the legislature and what the statute allows, and that's not, duplication of funds. But I think it's something that as a task force, we have to take a look at, a significant change that we need in the legislature. Because there are certainly communities and groups that are willing to move forward with projects, need a little bit of help, and it's not available now. And there's so much uncertainty still with RDOF. May not be till July or August that we know what they're doing on there. I think that you're going to end up with these tiny, tiny parcels in remote areas that aren't in the census blocks of RDOFs and are going to be real challenges for providers to even access because of that. There's going to be a lack of continuity from one service area to another. Revisit the incentives and the means for border to border to continue to be effective with this patchwork of RDOF in the state. So,
yep, I think that's a very legitimate concern and one that we should certainly discuss, and it could be a great one or a set of recommendations that we could make depending on kind of how that unfolds. So something we should really keep track on. Anything else? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Our next meeting, I'm trying to look on the calendar here real quick. Should have had it up. Diana, I don't know if you have it handy.
The next meeting is going to come up quickly, June 14th, especially with the holiday weekend in there. And we have ARC scheduled to present, as well as David Savalane with from the FCC talking about the emergency broadband benefit, where I see they went over 1 million subscriptions this past week.
Yep. So we got good 2 topics there, and then we'll have some time for subgroup updates. Okay. Anything else from the team?
This is Diane again. Sonia Borges and Bethke from our office will be taking on some more of the role with the task force. And ARC has requested that meeting be on the Zoom platform. So Sonia will be setting that up. We will be not on Teams next time, but on Zoom.
All right. Okay, everyone. Well, thanks for your engagement. Thanks for your time, for listening today and also being engaged and asking questions. Hopefully you found the topics to be relevant. Again, through the subgroups, continue to have discussions, and then as you have requests for speakers to come and talk to the group, bubble that up to myself or Diane, and then we can reach out to those individuals or those entities and see if we can get them on the calendar for the task force. So with that, I want to wish you a good rest, happy of the week, and we'll see you in a few weeks.